everyone and welcome back to my booktube channel, Lisa in Bookland. Today I'm here to bring you my September reading wrap up. It is a little bit early, it is the 28th of September, but I'm going to Madrid tomorrow, so I won't be able to film my wrap up any later than this. And to be honest, although I'm in the middle of a few things, I don't know if I'm going to finish anything else before October, which is a pity because I kind of wanted to enter October with a clean slate, but at the same time I don't want to rush the things that I'm reading either. I think I read 9 books total, which is quite good given that some of them are quite long. It was nearly like I was having a revolt against shorty September, which obviously wasn't intentional, but I just happened to read some longer books. I did participate in one group read and also read a book for Tudor Timber and probably like 2 other books that are kind of Tudor adjacent. So yeah, it was a really good reading month. I read some really fantastic things this month. So yeah, you know, some months are just like that and you just really enjoy what you read. So that's always really good to have. I suppose starting off with one of my less successful reads of the month, and that's this book, The Historian by Elizabeth Kostova. Saw this in a charity shop. I was intrigued by the title, The Historian, because I like history. It says it's an international bestseller, and the back of the book mentions library, ancient book and cache of yellowing letters addressed ominously to my dear and unfortunate successor. And I knew it was related to Dracula, and I thought that sounded really fascinating. But yeah, the most thing I can say about this book is that it's really long. Like it's over 700 pages, and I really feel like it didn't need to be 700 pages. It actually was plotted very much like the Da Vinci Code, as in like there's 2 people going around and like talking to people, and there's people after them and they're trying to find something. That was the exact same thing as this plot, but like the Da Vinci Code is way more pacey, and the difference between the Da Vinci Code and this book is there's actually 2 pairs of people in the same timeline doing a very similar task, and the writing between the both points of view is so like formal, and there's no differentiation about like whose point of view it is, not in the chapter headers or anything. Often you could only tell, so the 2 points of view are kind of broadly the daughter and the father, and I could only really tell it was the daughter's point of view when she said my father, and the daughter doesn't even have a name. I don't think so. I never came across her name. As well, a lot of the book was told like through these like really long and detailed letters that were supposedly written from the father to his daughter or the father to somebody else. There's like these really long, boring academic articles, and it's just like, oh god, it was a bit of a slog to get through. Like the basic premise is good. I should have started with that, but the basic premise is kind of about, apparently I didn't know this beforehand, but like Dracula is actually based, or he's thought to have been based on a real figure called Vlad Dracula, that kind of was a very tyrannical ruler in kind of Eastern Europe of the 1600s or 1500s or something. And this is kind of positioning like what if he's actually a vampire. So yeah, I will say that the start was really, really strong, and it was so like this book, if it was better, like this book would definitely be classified as a really bestseller like Dark Academia, because it starts off in Oxford and there's loads of librarians in it and they're doing research and they're like digging in these old archives, and I loved that whole vibe of it. And I did like the setting. Some of it's set in Oxford, obviously in England, but then some of it is set in Romania and Hungary, like in the Soviet Union days, so I really like the contrast of cultures there. It just didn't make up for the rest of the book. However, I will say it was really interesting because when I researched this book afterward, I don't work in publishing, but this book was really, really heavily marketed apparently when it came out. So like there was loads of pre-orders and people were really hyped up about it. And then the response to the book was actually, you know, quite mixed. And apparently like movie rights were sold, but the movie was never made. And like I've never heard anybody, maybe others have, but I've never heard about this book before for apparently an international bestseller. So yeah, I would not recommend unless you have very much an interest in Vlad Dracula already, or are really addicted to Dark Academia, but it's just so long. A pity really, because it was a good premise. So the next book then is one of my Tudor adjacent reads. I don't have a copy because I took it out of the library, and it's A Secret Alchemy by Emma Darwin. I just happened to spot this on the library shelf. I liked the title, and I picked it up. The back sounded intriguing. It's the first book set in the War of the Roses that I've ever read, and this focuses mainly on the life of Elizabeth Woodville. I knew she existed, but that's about it. And I did find some of the history confusing. I had to reference the family trees an awful lot, but I did manage to get my head around it somewhat eventually. And I am listening to a non-fiction book about the War of the Roses on Audible at the moment. Like, it is an interesting period. There's just so much of it. It's very complicated. As I said, I did manage to keep a hand at least of what was happening on the book. I would say that the writing style was quite confusing, which didn't help at times. So there's two timelines. There's a kind of a present day timeline and Elizabeth Woodville's timeline. As always, I found the past timeline way more interesting and could have done without the present day timeline most of the time. But even within timelines, characters would kind of go back in their own memories and think back on things, and it wasn't always clear that this is what they were doing. It is only when they mentioned something completely incongruous, you were like, oh, this is a memory, this isn't actually happening at the moment. So that was a bit confusing, but didn't like overly hamper my enjoyment of it. From the blurb, it promised to go into the mystery of the princes in the tower, so that's what I was expecting, but really it's way more about the events leading up to that, and that only happens in the end. So if you are picking this up expecting to hear a lot more about the princes in the tower and being told from their point of view and things, that's definitely not the case. But still, it was really interesting to learn about Elizabeth Woodville, which is a figure I hadn't known much about before. However, I think the highlight of this book definitely was that there was a really nice homosexual relationship portrayed in it. It's hinted at the very first page. There's like a letter at the start, and I just really liked the way it was portrayed, and it was just like such a mature relationship that was handled like realistically for the times. There's no I kind of hated this unrealistic acceptance, but I just really liked the way it was done. Some really touching moments. There's no internalized homophobia either, which I thought was refreshing sometimes in historical fiction. But yeah, I just think it's one of my favourites that I've read. I don't really read much romance, but when I find a really good romance plot in a book that you're not expecting it, I just really love it, and that was one of these. So yeah, I would highly recommend. And I know that she has another book called The Mathematics of Love, which is set in the Regency apparently, and I really want to read that, so I'll definitely be picking that up at some time in the future because I liked this book a lot. So the next book then is probably my real Tudor temper read, and that's The Six Wives of Henry VIII by Alison Weir. It's a non-fiction. That's just what it says in the tin. It's about the Six Wives of Henry VIII. I actually bought this in Hampton Court Palace when I was there last December. I kind of just finished the Wolf Hall books, and I really enjoyed them, but I was confused a lot, and and the figures that were coming in and out meant very little to me. And obviously this doesn't cover a fraction of the characters that appear in Hilary Mantel, obviously, as well as covering later figures that you don't get from those books. But I can. At first I was thinking I wish I'd read this book before the Thomas Cromwell books because I would have understood things better, but then I don't know if I'd have enjoyed this book as much if I had read it first. Maybe I'd have found it too dry. But I really enjoyed it. It was just the right level of detail for me that does not know a lot about Tudor history. I was surprised as well because I was a bit worried going into this book. I've only read one other book by Alison Weir, and that is the Katherine of Aragon Six Tudor Queens book, her historical fiction that I know a lot of people have been enjoying recently because there's a Tudor long going on. But I found that book way too long, and I actually thought at the time, I'm like, would I enjoy Alison Weir's non-fiction more, because I just felt like it was just too much detail in a historical fiction book, and I might have enjoyed the book more if it was actually non-fiction and wasn't masquerading as historical fiction. And it was true. This probably had a little bit less detail, ironically, because it's obviously about 6 queens, not just one in a massive book. But yeah, I suppose I'm just not interested enough in them as individuals yet to read an entire long book about one, but definitely sparked a lot of interest in me, and it did have some interesting little points, one thing that sticks out in me that I hadn't heard before, albeit I probably haven't heard a lot before, but there was a kind of a hypothesis here. I'm sure Alison Weir didn't make it up. I just thought it was interesting that Anne Boleyn had a medical condition which is very rare that causes women, unfortunately, not to be able to have a second child. So after the first one is born, they produce antibodies that will abort any second child. So I'd never heard of that before, but it nearly makes sense, I suppose, given the number of miscarriages she had and things. So yeah, very interesting read. I don't think I'll be going back to Alison Weir's historical fiction, but I wouldn't be afraid of picking up more non-fiction by her. I think for historical fiction, I might try Philippa Gregory first. I actually had a book by her on my TBR, the Red Queen, but I didn't get to it this month. But yeah, I can see why people love the Tudors so much. They're very interesting. So the next book I'm going to talk about is The One and Only Hamlet by Maggie O'Farrell. I read this book as part of a group read organised by Alison the Giant Bookshelf. Also in that book were Kristin from Enter the Book, Ray from Ray of Sunlight, and Jack from Spread Book Joy. So it was really nice discussing this book with people, and yeah, I think we all just loved it. And I'm actually not going to say a huge amount about this book because I thought from the back cover, and I think this is a common feeling across the group, that this book completely wasn't what we expected. I hadn't got any hints of this from previous reviews, so like, yeah, maybe it's just a really well kept secret. It really enhances your enjoyment, so I won't ruin that for anybody that's watching this video. But what I can say is Maggie O'Farrell's writing in this book was so descriptive and immersive, and like, if you're like me and don't really like descriptive writing, as I've said before, I don't see pictures in my head when I read, which a lot of people think is depressing, but I don't let that put you off. It was something about the way it was done here just really made you feel like you were there. Yeah, obviously, given the subject matter of the book, it's such a sad book, but all the characters that were in it were just so great, and I really can't praise the writing enough. And yeah, it's just isn't it funny? Like, I'd advise you, if you are going to read this, just to put time aside for it, because especially the second half of the book, I read it all in one sitting, like late at night. It was just, I couldn't put it down. So yeah, brilliant book, and I'll definitely be reading more by Maggie O'Farrell. And thank you to Alice for organising the read along. About that read along, I will say that we were supposed to read Hamlet as well. I am on the second act, scene 2. I just had so many other things that I was reading this month that I was really enjoying, that I'm not even going to mention here until I finish them. I know it was Shake Temper as well, so I'm sad I didn't get to finish Hamlet completely. I might still do it. I might read it on my phone or iPad or something while I'm travelling. I'm just interested to see if this has any links with Hamnet, and I haven't read it since Leaving Cert, where I studied it. You can see this is my Leaving Cert copy. But yeah, I'm enjoying it. I don't think I'll ever be a massive Shakespeare fan, but I definitely, if there were more Shakespeare plays around I could go and see, I would, because I saw Hamlet once, and I really enjoyed it. So yeah, I think Shakespeare for me will remain probably one of those plays that I have to see rather than read. And I know that's most people's preference for reading Shakespeare, but although I do enjoy the things I've read, I would probably reach for another classic instead. Sorry, Shakespeare, you've enough fans. Then jump forward in history, and that is The Professor by Charlotte Brontë. I'm very happy that this is the last Brontë book that I have to read. Apart from the poetry, I haven't read any Brontë poetry at all. God, I really am having no luck today. You probably are getting a different perspective again, because my camera just died and because I am packing. Can't find my camera charger. So the book I'm going to talk about next is The Professor by Charlotte Brontë. I'm really happy to have read this because it's the last Brontë book that I haven't read yet, apart from like the juvenilia or the poetry or anything, that I haven't read any of those yet, but it's the last major work I have to read. It's just a short little book, about 200 pages. I read this in a little over a day, so I did enjoy it on the whole. Like, it's definitely like Novellette, and it's kind of, the comparison is unavoidable because the subject matter is so similar. So this book, the big difference I suppose is this book centres around a male protagonist called William. Like Lucy in Villette, he goes to Brussels from England to get a teaching job. One interesting point that the introduction to this book makes is, if like The Professor was published and it wasn't published in Charlotte's lifetime, we'd probably never have got Villette. So this fulfilled his job, and yeah, I don't know if it should be that acceptable ever for an author to publish a book and then be like, I could have done that book better, and then write an improved version and publish it again. I don't know if anybody else has this edition of The Professor, but I was a bit worried when I read the blurb. It made William sound like a bit of a creep, and like the story would be extremely problematic. I'm very happy to say that that wasn't the case. apart from one moment where he was a bit of a creep, I actually really liked William. He had such an independent spirit, and I actually really liked the part in England before he went to Brussels to teach. That was really interesting. But unfortunately, because this book is so short, it does feel quite rushed. Like you're just the plot is flying forward fairly quickly, and you just don't get the time to explore things properly. A good example would be there is a romance in this book, but I just thought it was not really convincing. It wasn't nearly as good as VIII, so it was worthwhile read. I can see why it's often kind of forgotten about compared to the other Brontë books. So the last historical fiction I'm going to talk about in this video is Allegiance by Heather Domin, which is a reread for me. It's an ebook which the author actually makes available for free online, so I read it probably about a year ago, and I wanted something short. I was kind of in the mood for something Irish history given last month, and I just remembered I really liked this one. So the premise of this book is this MI6 agent called William gets sent over to Ireland in 1922 after independence to investigate this group that are suspected of kind of dissident IRA activity against the Free State. So William manages to integrate himself into their circle quite quickly. He gets a job in a pub and he manages to make contacts that way. I actually think this is such a realistic storyline and really well written for something that's been given out for free and is like self-published. I really like the dialogue, and the historical setting seems like really convincing. The main draw of the book, and like I mentioned for A Secret Alchemy, this actually has such a good romance. You kind of know going in, it's not really a spoiler. William actually starts to fall for his target, Adam, and they're just such great characters, and they never, like I said before, they kind of don't have that like internalized homophobia or like struggle over much. Just some really realistic and nice moments, and again, this is like a romance that like sticks out in my head as being brilliant, and it's so well developed for just like a novella. Like you really feel like you know these characters. I think it's genuinely a really, really well written book. So I'll leave the link to the website down below just in case you're interested, because I really did enjoy it. So the next book I'm going to talk about I also got out from the library, and that's Never Let Me Go by Kazuo. Ishiguoro. Finally read this book after being intrigued by it for years, and I just saw it in the library one day and I picked it up straight away. When I started reading this book, I could not leave it down. So this obviously is a very well-known book. It has a very well-known adaptation as well that I haven't seen with Keira Knightley. It starts off in this school called Hailsham, where the students are it's known that they're kind of a little bit different, and it's revealed very slowly throughout the book why. And I just thought that was done in such a skillful way. Like, I mean, there's no big reveal. The mysteries of the society are kind of revealed to us slowly, like it's revealed to the children in the school when they're growing up, and there's no big aha moment. It's just like unfolding realization, and that was just so brilliantly done. And the characters are just so wonderful. It's so fascinating to be inside Kathy, who's like the main character's head, and she has two friends called Ruth and Tommy, who also, they just have such interesting dynamics between the three of them, and just later events of the book are just so heartbreaking. And the way even that like places were described, like as I said before, I'm not a huge descriptive reader, but you got such a good sense of like Hailsham, and they actually go to other places in the book and you just get such a strong sense of place from the descriptions and the way the characters react to them. This book, I don't know what to say about it. It's more like an experience than a book. You can really just, it's best not to know much going into it, and just, is enjoy the right word, just experience it, we'll say. So can't recommend it enough. I would definitely be reading more Kazuo Ishiguro in the future. I've only read The Remains of the Day, but I've really liked hearing people talk about Clara and the Sun, so I think that will be next if I manage to find it again. So the next book I'm going to talk about is also the second book that I've read by an author, and that's Scarlet Feather by Maeve Binchy. Previously in March for the Irish Readathon, I read Circle of Friends, and it was like it's been one of my favourite books of the year. It was so heartwarming, and the characters are great, and it like kept you reading the whole way through. And I will say that many of those things are in common with Scarlet Feather. It is really well written and paced, as in pages like fly by and the characters are great, and there's no real dramatic events. It is kind of a bit of a family saga. I don't really know what I was expecting when it was called Scarlet Feather, but the title comes from two friends, Kathy Scarlet and Tom Feather, who start a catering business, and they name it Scarlet Feather. and it's about their significant others, some children they meet. I actually really liked the children, which is quite uncommon for me, and just their parents and things and how they all get on with each other. And I liked a lot of this book, but around the halfway point I was kind of a bit disillusioned with it. Not as disillusioned as I was with Rosamund Pilcher earlier this year, but I was a bit disillusioned because I could see where the plot was going and I was just disappointed. I was just like, oh, is this it? Like, there's not going to be anything more inventive, just this standard kind of storyline, and it was, sadly. So I was a bit disappointed in that way, but I did really like the coziness of the catering company and all the food and the hassle they had with customers and their various trials and tribulations. So I loved that section of it. Another interesting thing I found about this is like I had seen another book by Maeve Binchy called Quentin's, which is set in a restaurant, and the characters in this book go to Quentin's, and I can tell that probably some of the other characters in the book had a backstory that were in other Maeve Binchy books. I didn't spot any from Circle of Friends, but I just think that'll be really fun in the future when I read more Maeve Binchy, which I definitely will. I think this was just maybe a slight hiccup. Yeah, I really do recommend Maeve Binchy. Maybe not this one, but with one major stipulation. So there is a model in this book, and like Circle of Friends, like it was the one thing I have to say about Circle of Friends as well, is if you do have any issues about food or eating disorders, think very, very carefully at reading these books. I think Circle of Friends is published in the 1990s, and this was 2000, I think. They aren't dealt with sensitively at all, and the characters don't deal with them well. Probably that could be very triggering. Of his time, I'd hope that nothing like this got published now. It's obviously something I can deal with, luckily, and I really enjoy these books, but definitely approach Maeve Binchy with caution, I suppose. Maybe it had changed in her later books, but I'll keep you up to date if I do read them. So the final book I'm going to talk about is probably the highlight of the month, and I'm so glad I finally read this, another one that was long-standing and I had long interest in, and that is The Wonderful Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. There was a paperback and a hardback in the shop, and I made that very rare choice to get the hardback because I just thought this edition was so stunning. And look at the inside of the dust jacket with the dust jacket off. It's just really nice. It's funny because I had heard a lot about this book, obviously, and I knew it was about this guy called Piranesi who lives in this house by himself with one other person who he meets occasionally, and there's kind of statues and things, but I just thought it would be too weird. And something about the statues and the kind of impression of big rooms and the weird vague description, I thought it might be a little bit too highfalutin for me, like maybe there'd be kind of loads of classical references or something that I wouldn't get, so I was put off with it. But every time I heard it mentioned, I was still like, oh, that sounds really interesting. And I was there in a bookshop, I was taking off the book and looking at it and putting it back on the shelf again, and I think I did that 2 or 3 times, and eventually I picked it up and I brought it over to the till, and the man at the till he was like, oh, definitely, like, put that straight to the top of the pile because it's really, really good. And he's like, oh, I read that, and then I was off reading Jonathan Swift, and I haven't stopped since. So I was like, oh god, I don't know if I'm ready quite for Jonathan Swift yet, but I'll give this one a go, and I'm so glad I did. In the end, I actually would have liked to have read a whole longer book just about Piranesi going around the house and telling us about the different vestibules and statues and tides and things, because it was absolutely wonderful. And is it weird? I kind of wanted to go to the house, like, I just see it. It seemed so peaceful. Piranesi is such a great character. He's so full of kindness and compassion, and the ways he kind of manages to survive within the house and little ingenious solutions he's come up with. He's got such a kind of scientific brain. It was just brilliant. I loved reading about him. Another thing that I actually came across when I was reading this book is I googled Piranesi, and it turns out, I'm sure loads of people know this already, but it turns out Piranesi was this Italian back in the 1700s who did the series of drawings called Carceri, very badly pronounced Italian for imaginary prisons, and it's exactly how I imagined the house in the book, like these big halls of kind of broken columns and impossible stairs, and it's just absolutely brilliant. So I highly recommend checking out those drawings if you read Piranesi and you haven't looked at them. They're brilliant. So kind of surreal and slightly disturbing, but still fascinating. They're really great. So yeah, like the other book I've read by Susanna Clarke is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which I read all the way back in 2018. I liked it, but I think if I read it now, I'd enjoy it a lot more because number one, I know a lot more about the Napoleonic Wars, and number two, I'm like a much bigger reader now. So like I think at the time I was enjoying it, but you know, sometimes big books, if you don't know what you're in for, and it was quite weird, they can tire you out a little bit. So I'd definitely be interested in rereading that and her collection of short stories because I just really, really, really love this book. It's just so weird, but wonderfully weird. Like, I mean, even the dates. The whole book is written in kind of the form of a diary, but he doesn't give it like normal dates. Like the date for this one is entry for the first day of the 5th month in the year the albatross came to the southwestern halls. So yeah, it's just amazing. Really, really highly recommend this book. And I'm so happy to finish on such a good note. As I said, this is a really, really good reading month, and I am really enjoying some other things I'm in the middle of. I'm looking forward to October next month, and yeah, thanks so much for listening. Thanks for watching. Tell me if you have read anything good in September, especially if you've read one of these books. I'd particularly love to hear from you. So yeah, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next Thursday for my next video.